today we're going to tackle a very important battle. What battle are we talking about today, Jonas?
Battle of Lutzen in May of 1813.
Okay. This battle to me is intriguing for many reasons, but I think the biggest one is that the Allies thought Napoleon and his army were a spent force after the disastrous 1812 Russian invasion.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me to be a classic case of fool around and find out. Were the Allies overconfident, or was Napoleon just that good?
I think we can make statements in both ways as we were. So, there might have reigned a belief among the Allies that Napoleon would be able to rebound from the catastrophe in Russia. Because, the amount of men that Napoleon can have at his disposal through conscription, the withdrawal from veteran forces in Spain, and the men available in the garrisons in Germany and in Eastern Europe, along allies like the Poles, the Rhine Confederacy, were meant to reinforce the Grande Armée in its march to Russia. It gave Napoleon actually the means to regroup, and it actually proves, the organizational skills of not only the emperor, but also of Grand Marshal Duroc and the French general staff as a whole, who, in the initial absence of Marshal Berthier, due to fatigue from Russia, they actually helped to reconstitute the French army completely. And actually, when you think about it, why would, Tsar Alexander especially, or Frederick William and Bernadotte not be eager to go on the offensive? Because a chance like that didn't present itself very often in the previous wars. And the Russians, although spent and about to march into Europe once again, and then with the Prussians on their side since the Toroghan Convention, they actually had the momentum. But Kutuzov actually pleaded for caution. And actually, when he passed away in the end of April, his words actually would prove prophetic.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, just as you were talking, I was thinking about Napoleon was usually at his most dangerous when he had a small force, like in Italy in 1796, or even France in 1814, where people thought, oh, this guy's done. And
Yeah. You could still latch out.
yeah,
I
exactly.
agree.
Well, to give some battle on Lutzen, Napoleon's empire lost almost 500,000 troops in the invasion of Russia and left many of his allies questioning if they were on the right side. How did this sixth coalition representing Britain, Prussia, Sweden, and Russia come together?
Well, there were actually two main reasons for this. It's actually, Napoleon and the French Empire's continued expansion, and that combined with, the imposed continental system, which actually harmed European trade. And so for the individual nations involved, you actually have Britain. They were actually the main financer of the coalition wars. And they were actually bitter enemies of the French for many centuries. So they were always advocating a balance of power on the continent, which was actually disrupted since the revolution and through Napoleon's actions. And then you have Prussia and Russia that actually saw defeats at the hands of the French also since the revolutionary period. And especially 1805 to the 1807 period, there was actually, dark times for Tsar Alexander and King Frederick William. In the latter's case, Prussia's renowned army was humiliated, and they would look for a time actually to strike back, especially its military might.
Right.
And French rule was mostly disliked in Germany, and they were actually forming the seeds of a war of liberation in the region. And for Tsar Alexander, ever since the invasion of his country, he actually became a moral force to be reckoned with, because he actually started seeing himself as a liberator of Europe at the head of the Holy Alliance, basically also as a sort of messiah to drive back France to more conservative accepted borders and also the social reforms, because he wanted to counter liberalism and the secular state, which he felt were causes of this grand conflict. And then lastly, for Sweden under Bernadotte, he would be easily swayed, to join in his lot with the coalition, given his personal grievances with Napoleon in the past. The French also encroached into Swedish Pomerania, and, the imposed trade limitations of the continental system, it basically hurt Swedish trade.
Yeah, all good points. And notably, there have been 5 coalitions before this that tried to topple France and the various governments. And I want to point out that Napoleon was only in command of France during the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Now, he did have a hand in the 1st and 2nd coalitions, but he wasn't running the government in those 2.
Exactly.
Why did these previous 5 coalitions fail, in your opinion?
Well, there are a few examples to prove this point. When you look at the first coalition, which went from 1792 to 1797. So you have its members, Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, Piedmont, Sardinia, the Netherlands, and so forth. What were their issues? I mean, there's kind of like a lack of unity. The coalition partners always had divergent goals. So for instance, Austria, in this case, they wanted to restore the Bourbon monarchy. Prussia is seeking territorial gains in Poland. And Britain was actually focused a bit more on its maritime supremacy at the time. Then you have political unstable Spain, which had her home turf to defend with a crumbling overseas empire. So, it shows the lack of unity, basically. In France's case, nationalism and conscription, the levée en masse, mass conscription, it provided actually France with vast manpower, which actually overwhelmed the professional armies of the coalition. It also was combined with military innovation. The French introduced flexible army corps, aggressive offensive tactics, and they also had their citizen soldiers that boasted high morale. Also, you got to imagine the vastness of the fields of operations. How do you coordinate all this in the age of, written messages, 18th century logistics? Think about it. It must be easy. And then you also have battles like Valmy and Fleurus, basically turning the tide. And then you have actually Napoleon emerging as a rising star during the Italian campaigns, which actually forced Austria to sue for peace individually in the Treaty of Campo Formio. When you look in the main empire years, then, when you have Prussia in 1806 and Austria in 1809, actually, in both cases, they were backed only by the British. So in Prussia's example, the Russians joined in when matters already went to worse. And for Austria and Prussia specifically in those campaigns, they actually had the guts to tackle Napoleon with a honed field army by themselves. I mean, that's basically asking for trouble.
Yeah. And I really liked your point about lack of unity, even if it's just Prussia. Like, there's so many different generals and princes and kings you got to get orders from. With Napoleon's army, there was one guy, and there wasn't this miscommunication of orders or who's in charge of what army. It was one guy running the whole show.
Yeah, it's really correct. I mean, it's safe to say, like in those early coalitions against France, they basically failed to several factors. Like you mentioned, the lack of coordination. There's disjointed strategies, poor communications among the coalition members, which actually led to ineffective campaigning. Napoleon actually in his initial stages had the tactical superiority as well. Like he had innovative strategies based on timing, rapid movements, which basically outmaneuvered the coalition all the time. The Allies also had to deal with political and diplomatic instability. There's internal divisions, changing alliances within the coalitions. It actually weakens the resolve. And then there's also like the resource constraints. The Allies, they face these large logistical challenges and resource shortages, which basically hinders sustained military efforts.
Yeah, and for those wondering how hard coalition warfare is, I mean, ask Dwight Eisenhower. He had to organize all these different competing agendas and launch basically the largest seaborne operation in history, D-Day. And it's hard to do coalition warfare.
It's hard to tackle, yeah. Or even in this period, I think Schwarzenberg might have pulled out his hair in many occasions. It must have been very tough to deal with all the intrigues, the political movements. I mean, in some cases, allies were really close to to get at one another because of differences.
Yeah, I mean, at least Dwight Eisenhower didn't have the president, Winston Churchill, and Stalin in his tent with him. Like he was able to have a little buffer there.
They could be troublesome. That could have been troublesome.
Yeah, indeed. Well, getting back to this battle, Napoleon quickly cobbles together an army of 200,000 to face the Allies at Lützen. How does he do this?
I mean, to rapidly create this new force, Napoleon actually drew upon multiple sources throughout France and its territories. So you have the conscription levy of 1813, which actually already been authorized in 1812, which called up 120,000 young men, which was later increased to 137,000. Then additionally, France also mobilized the National Guard through a system of cohorts, which were actually meant for homeland defense. But these cohorts were converted into line regiments in early 1813, which added about another 78,000 men. You got to remember that many of these men were actually pushed into service through coercion. They had to, they were facing huge financial constraints from the government if, families couldn't provide their sons going to war. So it was basically better to just give them up and join the army anyway. Then you have all this additional manpower came from extraordinary levies. There was a supplementary call of 100,000 men from earlier conscription classes from 1809 to 1812. Then there was another 150,000 men from the class of 1814, which is basically called up earlier than it should be. And then there's also like additional contributions of around 20,000 men from departments and cities. So many of them were mounted and they were equipped at local expense. And then you actually also had the idle naval personnel, which were converted into over 24 battalions of marine/naval infantry.
I like to point out, why were they idle?
Well, basically, yeah, they were basically stuck in all these ports, harbors all across the empire, and they were meant to actually just to convert them into infantry and to make them worthwhile. They couldn't board any ships; they were all blocked inside these harbors. So better to get them serve in that way.
Yeah, I mean, they couldn't go anywhere because of the British blockade. So you have all these trained, basically artillerymen on boats, and said, let's get them in the army.
Oh yeah, for sure. Then you also have like the so-called the Guards of Honor, about 10,000 to 15,000 young quote-unquote elite volunteers, but which also kind of meant like coerced hostages. They were actually from wealthy families, and they actually had to pay for their own equipment and so forth. But it did actually add to the cavalry support. So halfway 1813, Napoleon actually mobilized over 650,000 men, but the vast majority of them are young and inexperienced. So only a portion of this, around 210,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry, they would be actually available in time for the spring campaign in Saxony. So actually, despite the sheer scale of the mobilization, the troop quality was mixed at best. Most of the new soldiers had little to no military experience. They had minimal training, and most of them actually were of poor physical development because Marshal Bessieres criticized the conscripts' frailty. But then you actually have Marmont praising them for their spirit and potential. The training was often rushed or neglected. Many conscripts reaching the front before even firing live ammunition. This is actually quite a problem. And even if they didn't drop out somewhere along the road due to fatigue and desertion, this is forced marching. There's also equipment shortages, particularly muskets. It all complicated matters. So Napoleon even suggested the use of captured foreign weaponry. And then you also have like the shortage in officers. Many experienced cadres were dead because of the Russian campaign, which actually hurt the esprit de corps of certain units. And there were replacements coming from military academies. There was retired personnel, or you just have like rapid promotion from the NCO ranks. So while high command was competent, so you have commanders like Ney, Marmont, Bertrand leading the corps. Basically, the middle and the junior officer levels were basically overstretched. And there's actually the study on the Battle of Lutzen in the earlier century, written by a French colonel called Lanrezac. He actually noted that the officer-to-soldier ratio were still high early on, but there would be no reserves to replace them when the battlefield losses would come into play. Then, lastly, you also have Napoleon reforming his cavalry, which suffered actually way more than the infantry. Think about losing 150,000 horses during the Russian campaign. So actually starting from about 10,000 survivors, Napoleon actually created 3 cavalry corps under generals Latour-Maubourg, Sebastiani, and Arrighi. And he was basically sourcing mounts and men wherever possible, even, like we mentioned earlier, like including units from Spain. So actually, on the whole, we can accept Lanrezac's, estimate of the army of 1813, because he actually quoted, like he said, certainly the new troops were not, the equals in value of the bands destroyed in Russia, and moreover, their constitution exposed them to rapid exhaustion. But nevertheless, they were good. The army with which Napoleon opened the campaign was a good instrument of war. However, it had in itself serious germs of weakness.
Yeah, end quote. Yeah, the interesting part from all of that was the middle officers, so like your majors and captains, and even the NCOs, like the sergeants that died in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you have the marshals, you have some of the divisional generals, but that middle echelon of frontline guys, it's hard to replace that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's basically experience, dying along with the men. It's very hard to replace. It's really those, the men basically within the regiments that can lead these men forward. And then, it also compounds with all the inexperienced young men coming into play, how to handle them. Then having to do all these exercises, drills on the march, it just makes things way harder, than back in the day. Think about the Boulogne camp, leading up to the Austerlitz campaign.
Yeah, I remember a story. I think it was in 1814 during the defense of France. Like Marshal Marmont had to show a new recruit how to load and fire his musket because he had no idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Or maybe even accidents happening. Like men firing their ramrods instead of putting them back. These things will actually happen.
Well, we're still leading up to the battle here. After the Russian invasion in 1812, the Allied army had some initial success in pushing back the remnant army under Prince Eugene, Napoleon's stepson, back towards France. In addition, one of Napoleon's famous marshals, Jean-Baptiste Bessieres, is killed right before the battle. What happened to the marshal who was one of Napoleon's favorites?
Well, we actually we have a few accounts on the event. We have Colonel Saint-Charles. He actually wrote a letter describing what happened, and I'll quote him. The Marshal Prince of the Moskva, aka Ney, at the head of his army corps on the march, had just passed the village of Ripach by his left, followed by a staff of which I was a member, and had stopped at the height of the last houses, presenting a large plain in front and covered with enemy cavalry, which pretended to want to vigorously oppose the continuation of our progress. Marshal Bessieres, arriving close to Marshal Ney, was told by the letter, "Ah, there you are. What are you doing here alone? Look, if your cavalry was here, they would do well." "I've just sent for them," replied Bessieres, "and they will arrive there," pointing to the ground with his finger. And at that very moment a volley of artillery was fired at our group, and as if it had made a long flight, one of the last shots struck Marshal Bessieres, threw him off his horse, hurled him to the ground with his full weight, at the same time as his blood and shreds of flesh, with which I was partly covered, were flung everywhere. The enemy, who were very close, then moved to carry out a charge, and Marshal Ney, while giving his orders to his troops to properly receive the attack, he exclaimed, "We must not leave him there." So immediately understanding his reasoning, I rushed down from my horse, which I abandoned, and I quickly seized the body of Marshal Bessieres, and in seeking some kind of refuge, I saw a gorge towards which I headed, and at the bottom of which I only reached by dragging myself, moving with my burden which I could not carry. There, unable to see anything, but surrounded by the cries of hurrah and forward, I took my sword, and supporting the marshal on my left arm, I waited with the firm resolution to defend myself, to perish with my dying companion, rather than see him wrestled from my arms and thus become a trophy of the enemy. And shortly afterwards soldiers came and helped me to carry him to the nearest house I could find, which turned out to be that of a weaver. There we laid him on a bed. I took off his sword, and found only a watch and a handkerchief in his pockets, after which I covered the marshal with a blanket, and as I was thinking of what to do next, there appeared an officer who was crying, and I asked him, with reference to his uniform, if he was one of the marshal's officers. When he answered that he was indeed one of his aides-de-camp, I gave the officer the sword, the watch, and the handkerchief, and I then returned to my post alongside the Prince of the Moskva, to whom I gave an account of what just happened. And after a pause, with an emphasis of sorrow, he pronounced these words, "This is our fate. It is a fine death."
Yeah, and I've often thought about what that means, but I think Marshal Ney means he died quickly and he died on a battlefield, which is a warrior's dream, I guess. If you're going to die, that's the way to do it.
There was like a portion in the excerpt where Saint Charles is saying that Bessieres was basically like still hanging on, but I think from other accounts like the shot basically ripped straight through his chest. So I think it must have been an instantaneous death.
Yeah, I heard he died instantly, but yeah, sad loss for Napoleon. Let's discuss the formations and sizes of each army before the battle. I think Napoleon has about 80 to 90,000 men and 372 cannon.
Mm-hmm.
The Allies have about the same troop size, but 552 cannon, so they outnumber them in cannons.
Yeah, so Napoleon's forces, actually, when you would include all the corps in the area, they would actually total, around 135,000 men.
Mm-hmm.
With an additional 15,000 cavalry and, like you said, 372 guns. So despite some corps being distant or incomplete in formation, the French army was positioned to use its numerical superiority effectively. So when you have the Grande Armée, you have a few components. So you have the Army of the Main, which obeyed Napoleon. It had a third corps under Marshal Ney, 45,000 men across 5 divisions, which included units under Generals Souham, Brenier, Girard, Ricard, and Marchand. So these troops were stationed east of Weissenfels, Then you have 4th Corps under General Bertrand. He had around 30,000 men, which was composed of Württemberg troops led by General Francmont, and Italian divisions under Generals Peyri and Morin. And these forces were scattered across key locations such as Burgau, Naumburg, and Jena. And then you have 6th Corps under Marshal Marmont. He had 25,000 men, with 3 divisions under Generals Campan, Bonnet, and Friedrichs, which were mainly deployed around Naumburg and Kösen. And then you have 12th Corps under Marshal Oudinot. He had 25,000 men, including Bavarian and Italian divisions. And that corps was actually stretched from Saalfeld to Coburg. Then you have the Imperial Guard, which is led by Marshal Mortier. He had General Dumosier's Young Guard, which consists of 11,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and General Rogue's Old Guard and its cavalry. They were stationed in Weissenfels, and the Young Guard was actually stood at Naumburg. And then thirdly, for the French, you have the Army of the Elbe, which was led by Eugène de Beauharnais. You have 11 Corps under it, under Marshal MacDonald. He had 22,000 men, divisions led by General Gérard, Freycinet, Charpentier. They were positioned east of Merseburg. 5th Corps under General Lauriston. He had 22,000 men spread across 4 divisions, and they were positioned behind Merseburg. And then you have some other units. Then when you look at the Allied army, the Allies actually fielded a combined force of about 95,000 men with approximately 65,000 infantry, 22,000 cavalry, 8,000 artillerymen. So the key difference here between the two opposing armies was that the Allies had an advantage in artillery and cavalry. So they actually had 40% more cavalrymen than the French. And they had around 530 to 552 guns compared to Napoleon's 372. Under that army, you actually have Wittgenstein's force, which was composed of General Berg and York's Corps, 7,500 men each. And you have Kleist's detachment, 6,000 men. They were tasked with securing the Leipzig area. Then you have Marshal Blücher's corps. He had 27,000 men, and he was located just north of Borna. The Russian Guard were 18,500 men, and they were stationed between Froberg and Kören. So they were actually offering a significant reserve force for the Allies. And then 2 more units, which were Miloradovic's corps, 12,000 men positioned slightly south of Penning. And then lastly, with Singoroda's corps. This corps was actually composed of 5,000 cavalry and 8,500 infantry. And they were positioned just west of Zwickau. And they would actually play a key role in reconnaissance and covering the western flank of the battlefield.
So, Jonas, here's the map in question. Can you kind of just talk us through what's going on here? This is just showing the convergence of all the different corps, right?
Yeah. So for the battlefield, just to indicate some key positions, Lutzen itself is actually way in the north. Then you have the 4 villages which were hotly contested: Kaya, Kleingürschen, Rana, Großgürschen. The Monarchenhügel is actually the green M, where all the red units are, which are the Allied forces. That's where Wittgenstein actually started the battle off. Other key positions: Starsiedel, center left, where Marmont would come in. Then the Grunabach stream, which is in the west of the battlefield, and Flossgraben is that canal running, basically also acting as like the eastern part of the battlefield.
Okay. Yeah, for those listeners, I'll put this episode on YouTube as well, so you can see it there. But if you're on Spotify, you should be able to see the map through our video. But yeah, the Prussians start the attack in the morning of May 2nd, with Marshal Blücher surprised to find a full division of French troops in front of him. What happens from there?
I mean, we can establish the objectives of both sides quickly to understand what the French and the Allies actually wanted to achieve that day. So Wittgenstein, he was the main commander. He was under the impression through engagements prior to the battle that Napoleon was actually posting a screen to cover a general movement in large columns towards Leipzig, and to then thrust onwards to Berlin to basically knock out the Prussians with a thunderclap. You have actually the author and historian Michael Legier. He actually, in his books on the 1813 campaign, he actually makes the argument that, the French emperor had quite a fixation on, the Prussian capital as his main objective. And so the Allies, on the other hand, they actually agreed to try and strike Napoleon's right flank. And it wasn't too bad of an idea, given all the open fields in the area, to actually make optimal use of their numerical superiority to drive the French into the marshes around Leipzig and Lutzen. But this plan actually required action, where Wittgenstein actually didn't really excel in. He was quite a methodical soldier. His fellow commanders would actually blame him of putting a lot of work and emphasis into details, lengthy orders that, once the action was underway, it couldn't really provide much flexibility. And actually, some orders actually also reached his colleagues hours later. And in such a time span, matters can change very quickly, and especially when you're facing Napoleon. So as we will see, it kind of meant that the Allies would get startled once they would encounter French forces unexpectedly due to a lack of follow-up reconnaissance. And they would start acting piecemeal. So they would basically negate their superiority in numbers that way. So yeah, to the battle itself, when Wittgenstein actually decided to attack the supposed French rearguard at 4 villages. You have Großgürschen, Kleingürschen, Rana, and Kaya, which were located northwest of his position. And the battlefield was, as it were, enclosed in the south by villages named Tornau and Werben. You have a stream called the Grunabach in the west, and in the east you have the Flossgraben Canal. So Blücher was actually ordered to capture these villages in the north with 1 brigade. But actually the determined Prussian general, he insisted on leading the first wave himself. So around 11:45, Blücher rode up to Wittgenstein, and he actually requested permission to begin the attack. He was blessed with the words of with God's help, and then he fervently led his first brigade into battle. And actually this surprise assault actually caught the French under General Souham off guard because they were still preparing lunch. They didn't station any forward posts, and actually Ney was blamed for this by Napoleon.
Of course.
So after intense fighting, Blücher actually secures Großgürschen, but the battle actually was far from over. So despite his initial success, Wittgenstein started to hesitate to commit the rest of Blücher's corps for a simultaneous advance on Kleingürschen and on Rana, 2 other villages, because he was actually starting to fear the unknown forces beyond these villages. So actually the defense that was being put up by Napoleon's troops there, they didn't longer seem like only a rear guard. So as a result, actually Blücher's 2nd Brigade was sent in to attack Kleingürschen at around 1. But Marshal Ney actually quickly rallied the French troops in that sector. So they launched a counterattack with 3 divisions, which basically overwhelmed Blücher's 2 brigades with more than double the manpower. So Blücher actually himself led a new assault on Kaya. But then during that struggle, he hit one of his close allies, Prince Leopold of Hessen-Homburg. He was mortally wounded. And then Blücher, you got to remember the guy is 70 years old. He actually demonstrated extraordinary bravery despite taking several hits. His horse was shot under him, and then he was also wounded by a bullet that pierced his side. And so when he was attempting to rally his troops, Blücher actually continued to fight alongside General Scharnhorst until he could no longer ignore his injuries. And basically these initial engagements, they were the onset of attacks after attacks of basically trying to get a hold over these villages.
Yeah, and Marshal Marmont hears the cannon fire and moves his corps up to get involved.
Mm-hmm.
Where is Napoleon during all this? I've heard that he's famously giving a tour of the 1632 battlefield of Lützen to his aides.
Yeah, well, actually, Napoleon initially didn't really believe that an attack was forthcoming before the 3rd of May. So most of his orders that he issued earlier that day, they were actually meant for that thrust into Leipzig. So once Ney's sector gets attacked, he throws his plan around, as he noticed that the Allied assault was growing in size. So Napoleon thus ordered a concentration of his corps. So Marmont, he ends up confronting the Allied left, where General Girard was also basically caught by surprise. The men were still in bivouac, and the artillery teams, they were actually sent off to gather forage and water. So there was this bold charge by a great force of Allied cavalry, which probably would have carried them away. But instead of that, the Allies would start to deploy their artillery, to which there was actually little reply. So we actually start to notice that the Allies are not acting in unison. So Then, covered by the village, General Girard was actually able to resist these partial attacks, and he held on until he was relieved by the arrival of Marmont. And the marshal, when he reached the village, he was marching in 6 large squares of a brigade each to actually face the concentrated Allied cavalry in that sector. And Marmont's arrival actually enabled Girard to leave the defense of Starsiedel to the marshal, and then he could then march to the aid of General Souham in the 4 other villages. And we actually have like a phenomenal French soldier's perspective on the Battle of Lutzen and actually the entire 1813 campaign. And it was written by a man called Narcisse Faucheur. He was actually a 19-year-old serving in the 26th Line Infantry Regiment, which was actually part of Marshal Marmont's corps. And he recalls in his memoirs, and I quote, "Our regiment stood in square, with arms at the ready, receiving without flinching the numerous cannonballs that the enemy hurled at us. But on our side, our artillery was also wreaking havoc in the ranks of the mass of cavalry which was opposing us, and which, on several occasions, attempted to charge us on our squares. They never reached our bayonets. Each time we were threatened with a charge. The guns were placed at the corners of the endangered front, and all the non-commissioned officers and skirmishers headed to the side that was due to be engaged. And when the enemy cavalry was seen to be sufficiently close, it was repulsed with canister and musket fire and then withdrew. And shortly afterwards, they would pretend to try again, or other squadrons would replace those that had been repulsed. And leaving General Ricard as a reserve, Marshal Ney then actually put himself at the head of General Brenier's division, and he led it forward with those of Generals Girard and Souham. And the Prussians were actually unable to stand against these much greater numbers. They were driven again from Rana and Kleingürschen, and Ney continued his advance on Grossgürschen. Then, met by a storm of artillery fire, the marshal was unable to recapture the village.
Yeah, Napoleon finally arrives at 2 p.m. and begins to develop a double envelopment plan. Is this correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So Napoleon arrived at the battlefield near the village of Kaya, where the situation appeared dire, but his presence actually immediately lifted the morale of his troops.
Of course.
And with even the wounded, even some of them first facing certain death, they were saluting him with cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" But, despite the reception, the emperor actually recognized the gravity of the situation. So he encountered fleeing soldiers, and he actually learned that 3 of Marshal Ney's 5 divisions had been severely weakened. So when he reached Kaya, he also received an urgent request from Marshal Marmont for reinforcements at Starsiedel. But actually, Napoleon dismissed this request because he was asserting that the key to the battle lay around the village of Kaya. And Ney's forces were at risk of being driven from these villages onto the plain of Lützen, which is, a situation that had to be prevented at all costs until, the Viceroy, Eugene, and General Bertrand could actually close in on the enemy's flanks and rear. Then you have the Imperial Guard. They also arrived at Kaya at the same time as the emperor, but he actually held them off deploying them because he was anticipating that the battle was not quote unquote ripe yet for a decisive strike, because he suspected that the Allies had reserves approaching, and which was actually the case because you have the Russian Grenadier and Guard divisions, but they were still not in position because these forces actually had been delayed by Volkonsky, because he actually saw the initial Prussian successes earlier in the day, and he actually advised the troops not to hurry because he believed that the situation was under control. And then by that time, actually, the Tsar, Alexander, he had taken effective command from Wittgenstein because he was struggling to resist the advancing French forces. So by 3 in the afternoon, Napoleon actually ordered General Mouton to push General Ricard's division through Kaya with support from Souham, Girard, and Brenier's units. And the French cleared the village of their enemy and launched an assault on Kleingürschen and Rana again, which were fiercely defended by the Prussians. Then French artillery between Kaya and Starsiedel, they were supporting this attack. And the villages and the surrounding area were basically left in ruins after hours of brutal fighting. The Prussians fought with an intense hatred for their French foes because they were actually driven by years of oppression, and they were displaying a level of bitterness not often seen in the previous wars.
Yeah.
And then by shortly after 5 p.m., you have Marshal MacDonald's 11th Corps. He arrived at Eisdorf on the Allied right, and its 60 guns were actually in the vanguard. And then at the same time, you have Morand's division, which Napoleon had finally ordered into action. They actually broke through the Allied left. So the French basically at that moment, had the momentum on their side.
Yeah, and my next point kind of speaks to what just happened with Alexander and Wittgenstein. The King of Prussia, Frederick William III, is also there and leads a charge of the Prussian Guard. As you mentioned, it's a very bloody, hotly contested battle. But I'm also not sure who's in charge of this giant allied army. The Russian Tsar is there. The Prussian king is there. General Wittgenstein is there. Blucher is there. Is this one of the issues that plagues the allied army's chances?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like the situation is actually complicated by, the leadership dynamics within the allied army. And this fragmentation of command actually contributed significantly to the difficulties that they would face. While Wittgenstein was nominally in charge of the allied forces, his authority was undermined by the presence of both Alexander and Frederick William, who both had a great influence over their respective troops. And I'm not even mentioning like hotheads like Blucher and General York. Then you have like Miloradovic and Witzingerode. They actually weren't also really at their best on that day. So actually all this resulted like in a lack of coordinated command. For instance, like the Russian reserves slowly advancing and kept waiting when they could have been used to actually turn the tide earlier in the battle. So this issue of divided leadership, with both the Tsar and the Prussian king exercising their influence, it actually prevented the Allies from exploiting their early successes and coordinating like a concentrated strategy to defeat the French. This issue, became even more pronounced when, Napoleon's clearer chain of command and his centralized decision making proved to be very effective because Napoleon could coordinate his forces more efficiently despite the challenges of the battlefield and the poor reconnaissance that he conducted prior to the battle. While the Allies were, suffering from delays and confusion to, basically to all these multiple leaders pulling the strings.
Yeah, and kind of once the Allied thrust stalls, Napoleon strikes back with a great mass of artillery, 100 guns, under the famous General Drouot. This punches a hole in the Allied army lines, and the Imperial Guard finishes the business around 6 p.m., and the Allies have to retreat. Why was there no pursuit by Napoleon?
Well, because, this battle actually required the French to converge on positions as they were moving to locations elsewhere. So it actually meant like sudden changes of plans with force marching coming in, which was very tiring for most of Napoleon's unseasoned troops. So Lützen, in Napoleon's case, was actually a battle of reacting to developments as they were ongoing. And there was actually no vigorous pursuit with cavalry because actually there was actually very little to work with in the first place. And performing this as the night, would settle in, it actually would prove dangerous because, you have actually Marmont's staff being fired upon at one point by his own troops in the confusion of the infantry fighting and the darkness. And the Allies actually, they counterattacked then with the elite and heavy cavalry. So it actually kept the French in a state of alarm throughout the night, denying the soldiers much needed rest and facilitating, the withdrawal of the Allied army.
Okay, so what were the casualties on both sides? I know the Prussians lose one of their most able generals in Scharnhorst.
Yeah, for sure. French losses, they amounted to 18,000 men killed, wounded, taken prisoner, which actually included 12,000 men from 3rd Corps, under Marshal Ney alone. And although the Allies claim to have, lost only half that number, it actually kind of seems in reality that both sides actually suffered roughly the same numbers of casualties. But you got to know, however, that, when the French army actually crossed the Elbe River a few days later, almost 35,000 men were missing because, you have deserters and stragglers doubling, this number of quote unquote casualties. It really shows the lack of experience with the men, basically. And then, Scharnhorst, he actually received a wound in the foot, which in itself wasn't very grave, but it was soon made mortal, due to the fatigues of the retreat. And he actually succumbed to his injury on the 28th of June of 1813 at Prague, when he was actually traveling to negotiate with Schwarzenberg and Radetzky for the armed intervention of Austria. Very sad indeed.
Yeah, he was a very talented general, and that's a big loss for the Prussian army.
For sure.
The aftermath of Lutzen and Napoleon's later victory at Bautzen was that of Pyrrhic victories. Yes, Napoleon held the field and made the Allies retreat, but they weren't resounding, clinching victories like Austerlitz and Friedland.
Hmm.
What did this mean to Napoleon and the Allies?
Well, yeah, neither side actually achieved, its objectives. Although gaining a tactical victory, the French actually paid dearly for a success, that actually brought no big gains. And while defeated, the coalition army was neither destroyed nor actually broken. And, there were dissensions, but, that followed the defeat. For a moment seemed to lead to a split between the Russians and the Prussians. They were actually soon overcome. And then actually by failing again at the Battle of Bautzen, actually the Allies realized that they were actually in need of a plan to counter Napoleon more effectively, rather than just taking him on directly in the field. And that would actually lead them to develop the Trachenberg plan, which would actually yield them victories as the campaign continued.
Yeah, that's the old plan where they shouldn't confront Napoleon head on, but only as marshals and generals. And when Napoleon showed up, they should retreat.
Oh yeah, for sure, and it would prove effective, with battles as Kulm, Dennewitz, and so forth. So
Yeah, yeah. Last question about this Lutzen. Did this battle induce Austria to get off the fence and cast their lot with the Allies?
I mean, Lutzen itself, it didn't really immediately bring the Austrians into the war, but it was a key turning point in the broader context of the 1813 campaign, because the battle actually made clear that Napoleon was still dangerous, but, his power was no longer unassailable.
Mm.
So actually following these battles of the spring campaign, Austria, mostly in the form of, Metternich orchestrating all this, he actually, became actively involved in diplomatic discussions with the Allies. And actually by August of 1813, Austria would officially join the Sixth Coalition. This decision was actually also largely motivated by the growing realization that Napoleon's power was waning. And, by aligning itself with the coalition, it would offer Austria a chance to influence the post-war order in Europe.
Yeah, it's an interesting battle to me, Lutzen. It's almost like a defensive victory for Napoleon because he wasn't expecting it to happen where it did. And he recovered nicely and won the battle, but it was just not like the earlier battles, like I mentioned, Austerlitz and Friedland. That was a knockout
It,
victory.
yeah, I like the follow-up basically. That the lack of cavalry and like I said, especially the reconnaissance would cost him a lot of battles. And then we also not mentioning the building up of all these partisan bands, the Germans taking up arms and disrupting his lines of communication, his logistic lines. But it would cost him dearly
Yeah.
as the campaign would continue.
Yeah. Very interesting battle. Thank you so much for that, Jonas. That was
No
wonderful.
problem.
Again, I really recommend you check out Jonas's WordPress. It's Napoleon Chronicles dot or yeah, NapoleonChronicles.wordpress.com.
Yes.
Really good translations there. A lot of firsthand accounts, right? Primary accounts of soldiers and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, for sure. Thank you. And thank you for
Yeah.
having me on once again.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we love having Jonas on. Always a great guest. And yeah, we'll see you soon, my friend.